The dust of the high desert tasted of chalk and regret. It settled on the tongue of Elara Mills as the wagon, a skeletal thing of splintered wood and weary oxhide, crested the final rise. Below, in the cradle of a rust-colored valley, lay Desiret's Hope. A collection of log cabins and raw, earthen fields, it clung to the land not like a home, but like a lichen, a tenacious, grey growth. The wind, a constant, low moan through the canyon, carried the scent of juniper smoke and turned soil. Her new husband, Elder Malachi, sat beside her, a man carved from the same unforgiving stone as the landscape. He did not speak, but his presence was a weight, as solid and immovable as the peaks guarding the settlement. His hand, when it had helped her from the wagon, had been cold and rough as granite, his eyes the pale, flat color of a winter sky. They held no warmth, only a quiet, absolute assessment. "The Lord has provided a new daughter for our flock," he announced to the small, somber group that gathered. The women, in their high-necked, dun-colored dresses, were a palette of shadows against the hard earth. Their faces were placid, their eyes downcast, but Elara caught the flicker of a glance from one, a woman with hair the color of faded wheat and a nervous tremor in her hands. Her name was Sarah, the second wife. The look was swift, a shard of broken glass, there and then gone, leaving behind a faint, chilling cut of pity. That first night, in the long, low cabin that smelled of cured meat and beeswax, Malachi laid down the law of his house. His voice was not loud, but it filled the spaces, leaving no room for dissent. Order is the foundation of Zion. A woman's virtue is her silence. Her faith is her obedience. Elara, whose mind still held the green, unruly memories of an Illinois childhood, felt the words settle on her like a shroud. She was the fourth wife. Rebecca, the first, was a stern-faced matron who moved with the grim efficiency of a well-wound clock. Then Sarah, the skittish one. And Miriam, the third, who was absent. Sister Miriam lost her way, Malachi had said when Elara inquired, his tone final. She could not bear the burden of the covenant. The mountain took her. Days bled into one another, a monotonous tapestry of prayer, toil, and silence. It was in the deep quiet of the second week, while mending a tear in Malachi's temple robe, that Elara found it. A scrap of paper, brittle and yellowed, tucked into the lining of the sewing basket. The script was a frantic, spitted scrawl, as if written in terror. "The covenant is not for protection, but for purification. He speaks of the unworthy branch being pruned. Sarah knows. She saw what they did to Abigail. They don't cast them out. The mountain doesn't take them. The covenant eliminates them. I am marked. Pray for M." The writing stopped, ripped away. Elara's blood turned to ice water. She looked up, and across the room, Sarah was staring at her. The second wife's face was a mask of sheer, unadulterated terror. Slowly, deliberately, Sarah brought a single, trembling finger to her lips. The silence in the room was no longer empty, it was now thick, heavy, and listening. The arrival of Elara Mills in Desiret's Hope was not a beginning, but an ending. It was the final snuffing of the distant, hopeful light that had flickered within her during the long, punishing journey from the verdant chaos of Illinois. The wagon that carried her was less a vessel of conveyance and more a hearse for her former self, rumbling towards a grave dug from red dust and dogma. When she first laid eyes on the settlement, a stark and desperate stain against the relentless Utah wilderness, she understood that the stories of a promised Zion were a delicate kind of poison, sweetened with piety to make the swallowing easier. Elder Malachi, the man who now owned her future as completely as he owned the land they stood upon, was the embodiment of this harsh new reality. His presence beside her was a glacial silence, a monument to an authority so absolute it required no explanation or welcome. His first touch, a hand of cold, calloused stone helping her down from the wagon, was not a gesture of assistance but of possession, a branding. His eyes, the pale and unsettling color of a sun-bleached bone, performed a swift and ruthless inventory of her person, assessing not her spirit or her heart, but her utility, her potential for seamless integration into the rigid machinery of his household and his faith. The community that gathered to witness her incorporation into the flock was a study in muted conformity, a collection of souls who had long since sanded down their own sharp edges to fit the prescribed shape. Among the sea of shadowed faces and downturned eyes, One fleeting glance carried a different, more dangerous weight. It came from Sarah, the second wife, a woman whose posture was a permanent cringe and whose hands fluttered like trapped birds. That single, sharded look was not one of welcome, but of a profound and chilling recognition, a silent warning passed between inmates of the same prison. Ilara, taking her place as the fourth wife in a hierarchy she did not yet understand, felt the heavy door of her new life slam shut behind her. The air in Desiret's Hope was thin and carried the scent of juniper and profound isolation, but beneath it, just detectable to a soul still clinging to a memory of freedom, was the coppery tang of fear, a secret that permeated the very soil upon which this Zion was built. The discovery began not with a grand revelation, but with the quiet, mundane terror of a loose floorboard. It was a sliver of space hidden beneath the rough-hewn wool of her sleeping pallet, a secret she had found by accident during a sleepless night when the weight of the silence felt like a physical pressure. The object she drew from that dark space was a ledger, its leather cover worn soft and greasy from handling, but it was not an account of grain stores or livestock. The pages within were a testament to a different kind of stewardship, written in Malachi's own precise, unforgiving script. The heading on the first page was elegantly inscribed, "The Covenant of Thorns, a sacred pact for the purification of Zion." The words that followed were a chilling perversion of scripture, a coldly logical framework for damnation. It spoke of the community as a perfect vine, and how a single diseased branch could threaten the whole. It outlined the process of identification, of watching for the subtle blights of a woman's spirit, the sin of discontent, the poison of questioning, the rebellion of independent thought. These were not mere failings, they were infestations. Ilara's blood turned to ice as she read the procedures for a wife deemed irredeemable. It was not excommunication, not banishment into the desolate wilderness, which was a death sentence in itself. The covenant prescribed a final, terrible sacrament called the pruning. The language was veiled in allegory, speaking of returning the unworthy element to the earth from whence it came, of a silent, peaceful ascent to a high place for a meeting with God that would leave the community purified and strong. Her eyes, scanning the tight columns of text, found the names. They were listed not as wives or mothers, but as entries. Abigail, pride. Pruned. Miriam, a murmuring spirit. Pruned. The dates spanned years. These were not women who had fled, they were women who had been judged, sentenced, and erased by the very men who had sworn to protect them, all under the solemn, sacred seal of this monstrous covenant. The ledger in her hands was not just a record, it was a death warrant, and as she traced the names of the vanished with a trembling finger, she understood with a sickening certainty that the empty space on the list was waiting for a new name to be inscribed. The whispered warnings began as faint as the scuttling of a beetle in the wall, so subtle that Ilara initially ascribed them to the tricks of the wind or the settling of the timber-framed house. It started with a piece of hardtack, placed deliberately on her kneading board when no one was looking. Turning it over, she found a single word, clumsily scratched into its surface as if with a frantic thumbnail: listen. The following day, as they drew water from the well, Sarah's shoulder brushed against hers, and a sliver of folded muslin was pressed into her palm. Unfurled in the privacy of the outhouse, it revealed a child's drawing, rendered in charcoal, of a woman with wild hair standing near a distinct, jagged split in the mountain, a place Ilara had never seen. Beneath it, the same frantic hand had written, he showed her the cleft. She was not the same after. The warnings were never spoken aloud, they were a secret language of desperation conducted in the spaces between Malachi's sermons and Rebecca's watchful eye. Sarah became a ghost of implication, her body a conduit for a terror she dared not voice. While shelling peas on the porch, she would hum a dissonant, mournful tune, her eyes fixed on the imposing granite face of the mountain that loomed over Desiret's Hope. When Ilara once ventured to ask about the previous third wife, a violent tremor seized Sarah's hands, sending a bowl of peas clattering to the floorboards. Later, as they knelt together to gather the scattered vegetables, Sarah's breath was a hot, frantic whisper against Ilara's ear, the words spilling out in a single, suffocated burst. Miriam did not flee. She asked too many questions, just like you do. He took her walking to atone, to see God's majesty in the high places. He said the mountain cleansed her. He came back with her bonnet in his hand, his face peaceful as a saint. She is still up there. The mountain took her, But it did not give her back. Then, as if the words themselves were a poison she had expelled, Sarah recoiled, her face draining of all color, her eyes wide with the horror of having broken the most sacred law of silence. She spent the rest of the day in a state of catatonic prayer, her lips moving in a soundless, endless plea for forgiveness, a living testament to the fate that befell women who knew too much and dared to speak of it. The defiance began as a quiet, stubborn flame in the deep, frozen well of Alara's spirit, a place the sermons and the suffocating silence had not yet been able to reach. It was not a loud or dramatic rebellion, for she had already learned the consequence of such a thing, but a slow, deliberate poisoning of the well of compliance from which Malachi expected her to drink. It started with questions, posed not in public to challenge his authority, but in the intimate, shadowed space of their home after the others had retired, her voice a carefully modulated instrument of innocent curiosity. She would ask about a scripture, not to understand its meaning, but to question its application, introducing a sliver of dissonance into his monolithic certainty. In Isaiah, she murmured one evening while darning his socks by the fire's low light, it speaks of learning to do well and seeking judgment. I only wonder how we seek it if we are never to question the judgment we are given. Is not the seeking itself a form of faith? Malachi's eyes, reflecting the firelight, had fixed on her, and for a moment, the placid surface of his demeanor cracked, revealing something ancient and hard beneath. He did not answer her inquiry, but instead spoke for a long time on the virtue of a meek and quiet spirit, his words circling her like a noose. The defiance grew. She was tasked with copying out passages from the Book of Mormon for the settlement's children, and she found her hand subtly altering a word, a phrase, bending the rigid prose toward a whisper of mercy, of a God who might value a questioning heart over a broken one. She began to linger a moment too long when taking a directive from Rebecca, a fractional pause that was not quite disobedience but was no longer instant, robotic submission. She cultivated a private garden of small resistances, watering them with the memory of who she had been. She knew he saw it. He watched her with the focused, analytical attention of a naturalist observing a peculiar and potentially dangerous insect, noting the slight stiffening of her spine when he pronounced a decree, the way her eyes no longer instantly fell when his gaze fell upon her but sometimes, terrifyingly, held his for a heartbeat too long. He began to test her, assigning her the most tedious, soul-crushing chores, speaking to her in a tone that was deliberately crafted to strip away her dignity, all to see if the spark of defiance would flare into a flame he would be forced to acknowledge and, according to the terrible logic she now knew governed this place, extinguish. The discovery of the secret sisterhood was a process of sensing a current of warm air in a frozen landscape, a gradual and terrifying realization that she was not alone in her terror. It began with the bread. The loaf she had baked one Tuesday was somehow lighter, the crust more golden, than any she had managed before. Puzzled, she found a single, perfect feather, a downy plume from a meadowlark, tucked beside the flour bin. It was a small, inexplicable kindness. Days later, while hanging laundry with the other wives, a sudden gust of wind sent a petticoat sailing over the fence. As Alara moved to retrieve it, the third wife, a quiet woman named Hannah whose eyes were usually cast down, reached out and with a grip of surprising strength, held her back for a fraction of a second, her head giving an almost imperceptible shake. Following her gaze, Alara saw the distinct, coiled form of a rattlesnake basking in the sun just where she would have stepped. No word was exchanged. The communication was in the pressure of the hand, the warning in the eyes, a language spoken only by those who shared a common peril. The true confirmation came during a long, monotonous afternoon of carding wool. Rebecca had left the room, and the atmosphere shifted palpably. Hannah, without looking up from her work, began to speak in a low, rhythmic monotone, as if reciting a psalm, but the words were a map of survival. A dropped stitch in the blue blanket means a husband is in a watching mood. A sprig of lavender on the chopping block means a meeting place is unsafe. The hum of the morning breaks means you are not alone. It was a clandestine network, a web of silent signals and coded gestures woven between the women, a testament to their shared, unspoken understanding of the covenant's threat. They were not a rebellion, they were a resistance of the quietest order, a system of sentinels warning one another of the shifting moods of their husbands, of the dangerous attention of the elders, of the whispered names of those who were being prepared for a walk. They offered no escape, for the mountains and the faith were a prison with walls too high to scale, but they offered the only currency of value left in Desiret's hope, a warning, a moment of preparation, the small, profound comfort of not facing the darkness utterly alone. In this sisterhood, bound by fear and a desperate, furtive loyalty, Elara found both a sliver of hope and the chilling confirmation that the danger she sensed was not a phantom of her imagination, but a rot that ran deep through the entire foundation of their lives. The marking of the unworthy was a ceremony of such subtle, chilling precision that Elara would have missed its significance entirely before her discovery of the ledger. It occurred during the Sunday sermon, with the entire community of Desiret's Hope packed into the long, low meeting house, the air thick with the smell of packed earth and unwashed wool. Elder Malachi stood at the pulpit, a figure of grim authority, his voice a rolling thunder that spoke of God's love as a refining fire and his justice as an unsparing blade. He preached on the parable of the wheat and the tares, his eyes sweeping over the congregation, and for a moment, they seemed to rest on her with a weight that made her breath catch. But then his gaze moved on, and she thought it her own paranoia, until she saw his focus settle with an unnerving stillness upon Sister Clara, a woman known for her gentle voice and the secret, beautiful wildflowers she sometimes pressed between the pages of her hymnal. Malachi's sermon did not change in tone or volume, but his language shifted. He began to speak of the beautiful, colorful weed that seeks to grow amongst the pure wheat, its vibrant petals a deception, its roots stealing sustenance from the righteous. As he spoke these words, his left hand, which had been resting on the open Bible, lifted almost imperceptibly. His thumb and forefinger came together, not in a pointing finger that would be too obvious, too accusatory, but in a delicate, pinching motion, as if he were plucking an invisible, delicate flower from the air directly in line with where Clara sat today. A collective, almost subliminal sigh seemed to pass through the men in the room. There was no gasp, no outcry. It was a shift in pressure, the subtlest exhalation of judgment. Elara watched, her blood running cold, as the men surrounding Clara did not look at her, but their postures changed, their shoulders squaring, creating an invisible wall of separation. Clara herself seemed to shrink, her head bowing lower as if she had physically felt the gesture, her hands trembling in her lap. It was not an accusation, not a trial. It was a diagnosis delivered from the pulpit, a quiet, public branding that required no words of condemnation, only the silent, unanimous understanding of the men who held the power of the covenant. In that moment, Elara understood that the judgment was not merely spoken, it was performed, a piece of sacred theater where the condemned was made to understand her fate not through a shouted decree, but through the terrifying, silent language of divine disfavor. The disappearance of Sarah was a void that echoed through the house, a silence so profound it seemed to swallow all other sound. It happened in the dead of a moonless night, with a swiftness and finality that left no room for questions. One evening, she was there, a trembling presence at the supper table, pushing her boiled potatoes around her plate with a hand that shook so violently the tin plate rattled. Malachi had watched her, his expression not one of concern, but of calm, detached observation, as if monitoring the final stages of a fever. When the household woke the next morning, Sarah was simply gone. Her palette was neatly rolled, her few personal items, a hairbrush, a spare apron, had vanished from their peg. The official story, delivered by Malachi over a breakfast of gruel, was that a weakness of spirit had finally overtaken her, that in the dark of night, she had succumbed to the devil's whisper and fled back to the Gentile world, forfeiting her place in Zion for the fleeting comforts of Babylon. He spoke of it as a tragedy, but also as an inevitability, a pruning of a branch that had failed to bear fruit. The other wives, Rebecca and Hannah, accepted this with bowed heads and quiet amens, their faces masks of practiced resignation. But Elara's blood was a drum of panic in her ears. Later, while tasked with airing out the room Sarah had shared with Rebecca, she found it. Kicked partway under the heavy wooden chest that held Malachi's temple garments was a small, carved wooden bird, a crude but charming thing Sarah had often fidgeted with, a treasured remnant of a life before Desiret's hope. It was unthinkable that she would have left it behind, this single, precious token of her past. Kneeling, her fingers closing around the smooth, worn wood, Elara's eyes scanned the floorboards and found something else, a faint, dark smear leading from the spot where the bird lay toward the door, a trail of droplets that had been hastily, but not completely, wiped away. The stain was not the rich brown of Utah earth, but a rusty, sinister color that could only be one thing. The wooden bird in her hand was not a forgotten trinket, it was a message, a final, desperate testament scrawled in the only language left to a woman who had been silenced. It screamed that Sarah had not packed her things in the dark. It screamed that she had not chosen to leave. It screamed that the mountain had not taken her, but that she had been taken to the mountain, and that the peace Malachi described was the peace of the grave. The mountain's secret revealed itself not in a single, blinding moment, but through a slow, chilling accumulation of dread and evidence. It began with the ledger, with the repeated, clinical term the cleft noted beside each entry marked pruned. The word was a hook in Alara's mind, catching on every whispered conversation and half-overheard remark among the elders. She began to watch the men, studying the direction of their glances when they spoke of God's judgment or the purity of the land. Their eyes, she noticed, often drifted not toward the soaring, sunlit peaks, but toward a specific, brooding shadow in the western range, a place where the granite face was split by a deep, narrow fissure that seemed to swallow the light. The secret sisterhood provided the final, terrifying pieces. A scrap of cloth, a drawing from a lost child, a description murmured during the mindless work of churning butter, all converged on that single, geological feature. Guided by these fragments of shared fear, Alara waited for a day when the men were occupied with a temple raising and the women were granted a rare afternoon of rest. Using the cover of gathering late-season berries, she slipped away, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs as she moved beyond the sightlines of the settlement and into the raw wilderness. The climb was treacherous, a path not meant for travel, littered with loose scree that shifted treacherously underfoot. The air grew thin and cold, and the cheerful sounds of the valley died away, replaced by the mournful sigh of the wind funneling through the rocks. And then she found it, the cleft. It was not a place one happened upon, it was a destination, a gaping wound in the mountain, dark and deep. The ground before its entrance was unnaturally clear of vegetation, and the air carried a faint, sickly sweet odor that she could not place, a scent that clung to the back of the throat. Scattered near the opening, half buried in the gravel, were not bones, for the animals would have taken those, but the other, more durable detritus of a life, a tarnished silver button, a broken piece of a hair comb, a single, small leather shoe, weathered and cracked by the elements. These were not the artifacts of hikers or pioneers. They were the pathetic, forgotten grave goods of the erased, the final, silent testament to the covenant's work. This was not a place of God's judgment, but a desolate charnel house, a secret so deep and so vile that the very mountain seemed to weep from the horror of it. The failed escape was a lesson in the absolute nature of their prison, a demonstration that the walls of Desiret's hope were not built of timber or stone, but of eyes and faith and fear. The plan, hatched in the silent, frantic language of the sisterhood, was for Alara and Clara, the woman marked by Malachi's pinching fingers, to slip away during the chaotic, pre-dawn preparations for the harvest festival. They would take nothing but the clothes on their backs and a stolen skin of water, aiming for a distant, unnamed canyon rumored to hide a trapper's trail. For a few, heart-stopping hours, it seemed they had succeeded. The cold desert air burned their lungs as they ran, their footsteps muffled by the soft, sandy soil, the settlement disappearing behind them into the vast, star-dusted darkness. They felt a wild, giddy terror, a sensation so close to hope it was indistinguishable from madness. But the land itself was the first warden. The canyons they had seen as avenues of escape became a labyrinth of dead ends and sheer rock faces. The rising sun revealed a landscape of terrifying sameness, a sea of red rock and scrub that offered no shelter and no clear path. Their water skin was nearly empty when they heard the first sound, a distant, rhythmic beat that was not the pounding of their own hearts. It was the sound of a single drum, carried on the thin air, a deep, solemn pulse that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Then, cresting a ridge ahead of them, they saw the riders. They were not in a frantic pursuit, but sat astride their horses in a silent, unmoving line, blocking the way forward. Elder Malachi was at the center, his face not contorted in anger, but etched with a profound, chilling disappointment, as if he had discovered a fundamental flaw in God's creation. They had not been chased, they had been anticipated, their desperate flight mapped onto a geography the elders knew intimately. There was no struggle, no dramatic capture. The men simply closed in, their silence more terrifying than any shouted curse. As Malachi took the reins of Clara's horse, his gaze met Ilara's, and in it she saw the final, terrible truth. Their prison had no physical walls because its boundaries were carried in the minds and souls of its captors. They had never had a chance of escape, only the illusion of one, a cruel test administered by a wrathful God whose prophet now led them back to a judgment that was no longer a threat, but an inevitability. The ritual was not one of rage, but of serene, terrifying order. There was no struggle, no bonds, for the ultimate control was the absolute certainty that there was nowhere left to run. When Malachi came for her, his face was a placid mask of sorrow, his voice a low, resonant hum of finality. "The branch must be pruned," he said, his words not a condemnation, but a simple statement of divine horticulture. "For the health of the vine." She was not dragged, but escorted, a solemn procession of the elders forming around her as they left the sleeping settlement and began the ascent into the cold, dark embrace of the mountain. The other wives were made to watch from their doorways, a living lesson in the cost of a murmuring spirit. The climb was conducted in a silence broken only by the scuff of boots on stone and the mournful wind that seemed to keen through the canyon. They did not treat her with violence, but with a chilling, ceremonial reverence, as if she were a sacred object being prepared for a bloodless sacrifice. When they reached the yawning darkness of the cleft, the men formed a half-circle, their figures black against the bruised pre-dawn sky. Malachi led her to the very edge, where the solid rock gave way to an abyss that seemed to breathe out a cold, ancient air. He did not push her. Instead, he stood beside her, his hand resting on her shoulder not as a restraint, but as a final, paternal gesture. He spoke then, his voice echoing slightly in the stone chamber, not of hellfire or punishment, but of purification, of returning a flawed vessel to the earth to be remade perfect in the next life. He spoke of love, a love so severe it could not tolerate a single blemish. His words were a gentle, inexorable pressure, more confining than any rope. The ritual was her choice, a test of her ultimate faith. To step back was to embrace the world and its corruption. To step forward was to embrace God's harsh mercy. The horror was not in being thrown, but in the understanding that this was the culmination of the covenant's logic, a ceremony where her own annihilation was framed as the highest form of grace. As the first sliver of sun breached the horizon, painting the rocks in hues of blood and gold, Malachi's hand fell away. The choice was now hers, made in the face of an entire theology designed for this single, terrible moment, the final, elegant mechanism of elimination where the victim is led to the edge and asked to complete the sacrament themselves.